There's a particular kind of silence that follows when someone decides to stop answering a parent's calls. Not the silence of forgetting or being busy or drifting apart the way old friendships do. A deliberate silence, a chosen one. And to most people watching from the outside, that choice looks like one of the coldest things a person can do. But what's actually happening inside the mind of someone who makes that decision? And why, for some people, walking away from the people who raised them isn't an act of cruelty, but something that feels closer to survival? Most people assume that cutting off family is a reaction. Something dramatic happened. There was a blow-up, a final argument, a betrayal too large to forgive. And sometimes that's true. But psychological research tells a more complicated story, one where the decision to end contact with a family member is less about a single event and more about a slow neurological recalibration that's been building for years. To understand why this happens, you first have to understand how the brain encodes the concept of family in the first place. From the earliest years of life, the brain is wiring itself around the people it depends on. The limbic system, the emotional core of the brain, learns to associate certain faces, voices, and physical presences with safety, comfort, and belonging. Oxytocin, the neurochemical most associated with social bonding, floods the system during moments of warmth, physical closeness, and emotional attunement between a caregiver and child. This creates what researchers call an attachment blueprint, a template the brain uses for all future relationships. Here's where it gets interesting. That blueprint doesn't only encode the good, it encodes the pattern. So if a child grows up in an environment where love is inconsistent, where warmth is unpredictable, where connection is followed by criticism or fear, the brain doesn't learn, "my family is unsafe." It learns something more complicated, that love and pain are part of the same package, that closeness and tension are inseparable. Neuroscientists refer to this as trauma bonding on a neurological level, and it's far more common than most people realize. For years, sometimes decades, people operating from this blueprint will try to resolve the dissonance. They'll adjust their behavior, they'll lower their expectations, they'll reframe the dynamic, excuse the patterns, minimize the hurt. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rationalization and long-term thinking, works overtime trying to reconcile the emotional reality with the cultural story they've been told, that family is everything, that blood is permanent, that you owe your origins a certain loyalty. And this is where the outside world gets it wrong. When someone finally cuts contact, observers tend to interpret it as impulsive, as an overreaction, as selfishness dressed up in psychological language. But for the person making that choice, the opposite is usually true. Research on estrangement, including a large-scale study by Professor Carl Pillemer at Cornell University, found that for most people, cutting off a family member was not a sudden decision. It followed years of attempts at repair, boundary setting, and hoping things would change. The decision came not from giving up too easily, but from exhausting every other option first. What's happening neurologically in that moment is something like a threat assessment override. The amygdala, which processes perceived danger, eventually begins registering certain family interactions the same way it would register any chronic stressor. Cortisol levels rise in anticipation of contact. The body moves into a low-grade defensive state. And at some point, the brain, which is fundamentally wired for self-preservation, begins associating proximity to that person not with belonging, but with threat. This doesn't mean everyone who cuts off a family member has been abused in ways that are visible or obvious. Sometimes the harm is subtler: chronic emotional dismissal, a parent who couldn't regulate their own anxiety and passed it through every interaction, a sibling whose behavior destabilized the home for years, a family system that required one person to stay small so others could feel comfortable. The brain doesn't distinguish between dramatic harm and quiet, sustained harm. It simply tracks the cost of closeness over time. That said, it's worth naming something that tends to get lost in these conversations. Estrangement is not always clean, it's not always the right call, and the people who are cut off, the parents, the siblings, are not always villains.
Some of them are genuinely confused. Some of them are carrying their own unprocessed blueprints, repeating patterns they were never given the tools to see. The psychology of estrangement is not a story with a clear hero. It's a story about two or more people, all trying to manage their nervous systems, all working from inherited templates they didn't choose. Here's the insight that tends to reframe things considerably. Studies on adult estrangement consistently find that the people most likely to cut off family are not, on average, people who struggle with relationships broadly. They're often people with a high degree of self-awareness, a strong internal sense of identity, and, perhaps most counterintuitively, a deep capacity for attachment. The very people who feel things most acutely are the ones most likely to eventually recognize that a relationship is costing them more than it's giving. And the very strength of that original attachment is part of what makes the severance so painful and so significant. Cutting off family, in other words, is rarely done by people who don't care. It's most often done by people who cared enormously for a very long time and reached a point where continuing to do so was incompatible with their own psychological stability. There's also something worth understanding about identity. One of the underexplored reasons people cut contact isn't just about escaping harm, it's about becoming. The self-concept, which is how we understand who we are, is partly built in relationship to others. For some people, the version of themselves that exists inside their family of origin is fundamentally at odds with who they've become or who they need to become. Every visit, every phone call, every holiday pulls them back into an older identity, one that might have been adaptive in childhood but has become a kind of psychological compression in adulthood. Distance for these people isn't about rejection, it's about coherence. It's about refusing to keep splitting themselves in two. What this ultimately reveals is something broader about human psychology. We are social animals who didn't evolve to exist in isolation from our origins, and yet we are also meaning-seeking creatures, capable of rewriting our own narratives. The tension between those two things is not a modern invention, but modern life has made it more visible, more discussed, and for many people, more survivable. People can now name what happened to them. They can find frameworks. They can, in some cases, build the kind of chosen family that gives them what their biological one couldn't. None of this is a prescription. Understanding why something happens is not the same as endorsing it. For some families, ruptures heal, contact resumes, people change, and relationships find new forms. For others, the distance becomes permanent, not out of bitterness, but out of a quiet acknowledgement that some gaps are too fundamental to bridge. What remains, in almost every case, is complexity. The person who stopped answering calls isn't a cautionary tale about ingratitude. They're someone whose nervous system reached a conclusion, after a long and usually painful process, that proximity wasn't the same as safety, that obligation isn't the same as love, and choosing a quieter life, even at the cost of a complicated grief, was the most honest thing they could do. That's not coldness. In its own way, it's a kind of care, for themselves and sometimes for the relationship itself, which might only survive at a distance. If this kind of topic resonates with you, you'll probably find yourself equally drawn to the psychology of people who struggle to ask for help, because beneath both patterns, there's usually the same thing quietly running the show.